Good afternoon from the 1011 Now streaming studio. I'm Danielle Shank. This is Inside the Story with the Flatwater Free Press, a nonprofit news organization in Nebraska that emphasizes investigations and feature stories. So today we're sitting down with a journalist who wrote a story about a hike and bike trail in York. So joining us now on screen is Natalia Alamdari. How's it going?
Hi, good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. So let's kind of start from the beginning here. The city of York had gotten quite a bit of money from the federal government. Tell us a little bit about how much and what they're planning to do with it.
Sure. So, about 2 years ago, as part of a federal transit grant program, the city was able to qualify for a $15.6 million grant to go towards a transit project. So, the project that they had pitched during the grant process was a bike pedestrian trail, kind of connecting the existing trails in York. So, you would have a connected trail system in the city, but then also having a segment of the trail coming 80 to get you down to the interstate area, right where 81 and the interstate intersect. Another part of that includes a pedestrian bridge proposed to go over Highway 81, so you could have safe crossing in the area, along with things like, street crossing improvements, school crossing improvements, things like that.
Right. And so many would think that building a hike and bike trail is a mostly positive thing, but is that not the case here?
Right. So it's something that a lot of towns the size of York will spend like years and years trying to save for. I think the mayor had told me like this is the biggest grant that they've ever qualified for. So it's something that to the city council, they look at it as, this is a really great way to improve quality of life, add transportation options to people, especially if people are wanting to get around in a car-free way around York. Like one of the things that was told to me was, kids could ride their bike to school or they could ride their bike to the pool area in York or the baseball field, and just like really seeing this as a quality of life improvement that can help people already in York and can help businesses kind of market for new employees, maybe thinking about moving to York. But kind of the downside of it really centers on this 1 2 mile stretch of road, really the part connecting downtown York down to Highway 81. So if you see that diagonal line on the map, like running along Highway 81 towards the south end of the map, that stretch of road, or that stretch of the path, rather, it doesn't go on any major roadways. And so if you're an engineer, you look at it and you say, oh, there's an abandoned railroad here. Like that is a perfect like rails to trails kind of way to build out this bike infrastructure. But for some of the residents who live along that same stretch of road, that piece of the path would run either through their backyards or directly up against their backyards. And these are like pretty big acreage type homes. So their backyards kind of are more wooded. There's a lot of space behind your house, trees. The way one mom described it to me was like her kids can go play down by some of the trees and she can't necessarily see them from the house, but like she knows that they're safe back there. And so kind of the hesitance is, this idea of putting a trail through backyards. There is some fear over, having that direct path so close to the interstate, like what potential harm could that bring in for the families living along there? And it gets a little complicated because if you're not being directly impacted, like if your land isn't needing to be purchased, then you don't really
Mm-hmm.
have a ton of room to say like, well, I would like a fence put in along there. That's maybe something that you have to do yourself. If you are having to sell land to the city, then you do have a little bit more ability to talk through that aspect of things. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, really right now the main concern is safety, and also people just kind of feeling like they haven't really been heard through the process.
Right. And so, I mean, like you had just mentioned, is that the land acquisition piece of this, with this trail being so long, there's quite a few property owners that would maybe have to give up some land, or the city would have to work with to acquire this piece of land to put the trail on.
Yeah, It's not a huge number actually, because what York is trying to do is they're trying to really keep that as minimum as possible,
Okay.
like the number of people that they're having to purchase property from. I believe the number a lot entirely through town, the number was 21.
Hmm.
Now there might be more people who are adjacent to the path, and that's kind of the issue that you're seeing more in that southern diagonal stretch, where it's people who are adjacent but it doesn't actually like cut through their property. So if you look at the adjacent number, it does bring it back, it brings it to a higher total. But as far as people who are going to have to actually sell a portion of their land, that's closer to 21 throughout town. And that brings up a whole other, that's a process that's its
Hmm.
own thing, talking about how much the city would pay for the land, whether they would, if a person wants fencing or lighting, like that's a whole separate
Hmm.
conversation that happens once the final path is established. And they're really still in that of figuring out what the final path is going to be. The map that has been shown, it's kind of shifted over the years. It's still tentative. It's looking like this might be kind of a final version. But when I was talking to the city for this story, even they were saying like we're still going through all of the public comments that we got, seeing what kinds of adjustments we can make so that this can be as like minimally invasive for people as possible.
Right. And so hearing concerns from residents is one of the big things that's been happening throughout this. And residents have been voicing their opinions with signs. I'll scroll up to the top of the article here with, as you can see with the picture here that says these signs protect, don't connect. One way that they've been showing either opposition to this trail or they're trying to also speak with city council members. So kind of talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the signs are one way that folks are talking about how they feel about it. I know like door knocking has been another part of, you knock on doors, talk to people about how you're feeling about it. Maybe they put a sign in their front yard. As far as city council members, to get on the agenda, you have to ask either the city administrator or the clerk, someone with the city. You have to say, hey, I would like to be on the agenda this week, and they'll put you on it. You get 5 minutes to talk. Basically, like for the past months, year, I don't know the exact timeline,
Mm-hmm.
someone has been at the city council meeting to talk about this in some capacity, whether they think it's a good idea, whether it's a bad idea. This past week, like the most recent um, thing to occur is a lawyer spoke on behalf of one of the families that lives along that 2 mile stretch along South Grant Avenue. The same lawyer sent a letter to the city council kind of laying out the same complaints that have been talked about in city council meetings and in the story, and also kind of hinting at this idea of, if the path stays as it is, if it still cuts behind those backyards, landowners are prepared
Mm-hmm.
to seek some sort of legal recourse. Whether or not that happens and what that actually looks like is still a little up in the air, but it has been said at least.
Right. And so this has been quite the process for city leaders and just the city of York itself. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that you found out through investigating this story?
I mean, I just think it's really interesting to see, you look at it and you think, wow, 9 miles of trails, like that sounds really like straightforward. You're getting all this money for it, pretty cut and dry. But then like to see, um, you know, the reaction it gets from people in town and kind of how it spreads throughout a town is really interesting. Like I was driving around York and there are a couple main roads where you can see just like a number of signs all along the sidewalks, like in people's yards. But this is still a work in progress. It'll be interesting to watch what happens from here. I know there are like federal deadlines the city has to keep up with in terms of, acquiring land, having different environmental plans in place. Right now, they're in the phase of, what is the environmental impact of a potential path and taking public comment into account. So it's still very early on in the process, but there's a lot that has to get done from now to 2026 to, I think, around 2030 is when construction would start. I can't remember that off the top of my head, but
Hmm.
that's about the time frame, is 2022 when they got the grant to being finished around like 2030, 2031.
So does York have a deadline to kind of get something in place before this money, to do something with this money?
I believe the deadline for having the path finalized and having those land acquisition conversations is sometime in 2026. So there's still the rest of this year, all of 2025, and then however long into 2026 they have to wrap that up. So the city themselves, when I asked about it, they didn't seem too concerned as far as potential legal action throwing a wrench in this. But really, their main concern is they have to stick with, federal regulations and federal deadlines to make sure that the grant money continues to be able to go towards this. Because the thing that's unique about this grant is that it has a really typically there's a pretty high match requirement for local governments when they get a federal grant, but this one has a significantly lower match requirement for rural communities like York.
All right.
So
And so,
less money having to come out of the city's pocket.
right. And so as we kind of wrap things up here, what would happen if York doesn't spend that money and they hit the deadline?
Uh, that question might be a little more complicated than I can answer, because it's not that the money goes. It's not like, okay, they say, oh, you get this grant, $15 million doesn't
Hmm.
just end up in York's bank accounts. It's kind of a department. Nebraska Department of Transportation is helping with like the accounting side of things. Like the very, very bare bones explanation
Hmm.
would be like, if they don't meet these certain grant requirements, then um, it could jeopardize like the federal government continuing to release that money, is my very basic understanding of
Understanding.
how federal grants work.
Alrighty. Is there anything else you want to add about this story?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
All right. Thanks so much for joining me here, Natalia.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll talk to you soon as we check in with the Flatwater Free Press more often, as we check in with you on what you're working on. Alrighty. So
Sounds good. Thank you.
Natalia's article, Trail on Trial to York Leaders, It's a Dream, to Neighbors, It's Something Else, is available on 1011now.com or flatwaterfreepress.org. And for more news and updates, you can visit our website and follow us on all of our social media platforms. From our newsroom to wherever you are, we'll see you on the next stream.